Hello, friends. Today I, a Ukrainian historian, will tell you about the peculiarities of Russians, why they stand out from the rest of humanity, why they wish to set themselves apart from the rest of humanity. And here there are very ancient and very authoritative sources to explain these things. In particular, the father of history, Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, he wrote that on the territory of modern central Russia, that is, northeast of Scythia, beyond the desert, that is, beyond some forest, apparently, in the Zalesai lived a tribe of androphagi, that is cannibals. And what were their peculiarities of these cannibals? The study of these features, these cannibals by the sources of Herodotus, as well as the sources of other historians, very ancient, they make it clear that history, it turns out for history, 1,000 years is a trifle. And here is what he wrote about these androphagi. Above the Scythian farmers far lies the desert, that is, higher, to the north. Beyond the desert live the androphagi, a peculiar but not at all Scythian tribe. Also to the north extends the real desert, and no people there, as far as I know, any more. The northern parts of Scythia, running along the Istr, border first the Agathires, then the Agathires are the Dacs, then the Nuri are the Baltic, then the Androphagians, that is to the northeast, and finally the Melanklini. The Melanklini are some people most likely to be identified with the Indo-Iranian group. Among all the tribes, the androphagi have the most fierce customs. They have neither truth nor law. Androphagi are nomads. They wear clothes similar to those of the Scythians, but their language is peculiar. They're the only cannibal tribe in that country. So, what do we see? Androphagi. They have the most savage customs. Well, it looks a little bit like modern Russia. Probably similar, based on the fact that in Russia, the crime rate, crime statistics, is approximately 30 to 40 times worse than in Western Europe. That is, the androphagi have the most fierce customs. They have no truth, no law. Well, as Herodotus wrote. I mean, well, the truth, it is clear that there is no truth, because Russians think that it is good to steal. Well, at least 90% of them do. To kill is good. And all the Mosaic commandments do not apply to them. There is a special Russian truth, which is completely different from the truth of other people. That is, they have, as Herodotus wrote, neither truth nor law. Well, as for law, lawlessness is a typical Russian word. And what does it mean? It is absolutely clear. That is, there is no law in Russia in reality. For the first time ever, Russian deputies in the hall of the Russian Federation Council or Duma read the constitution. There were such sources. Androphagi are nomads. Well, I already told you about the cause of Russian drunkenness. That is, alcoholism, high alcoholization. Because the nomads in the cold climate did not produce an enzyme for a very long time. An enzyme that breaks down alcohol in a timely manner. And, accordingly, this testifies that the ancestors of Russians who have this alcoholic gene or Asian gene, somewhere around 70% of them were almost certainly nomads. And was in the northern regions, not in the southern regions, where all this fermentation products were consumed, but in the northern regions, where there was no such thing. Therefore, as a matter of fact, the Russians, when they get drunk, want to add more, well, and fight with someone, because they feel bad. Clothes, to quote Herodotus, they, androphagi, wear clothes similar to Scythian. That is, they look like people, like other people. But I can say the same about the Russians, they also look like people. But their language is special. Well, as for the language, it's probably meant that the Scythians have the Indo-European languages, the entire Scythian group. and the Androphagi, respectively, had non-Indo-European languages. Well, there were various Finno-Ugric tribes in that territory, in the territory of Silesia, that's understandable. I have already said that Muscovy is a Myrian country, a Myrian principality. Then it turns out that cannibalism was practiced not only by these Androphagi, but also by other peoples, who lived to the east of the Androphagi. Here is how Herodotus writes: the Scythians visiting the Argipians exchanged goods, using 7 interpreters of 7 languages. However, we know nothing about the area above the Scythians in the north except what these people tell us. It is said that the Scythians have a custom that when someone's father dies, all his relatives bring a lamb, then they prepare a sacrifice, finally chop the meat and add to it the meat of their master's dead father, then they mix it all up and make a feast. But they pluck the hair from the head of the dead man, clean it well, gild it, and keep it at home as a jewel, offering great sacrifices to it every year. The son does this to his father, as Ellen does when he celebrates the feast of his dead parents. In all this country, which I have described, the winter is so severe that unbearable frost lasts 8 months, so that when you spill water, it does not make the earth swamp, but when you make fire, there may be mud. Herodotus wonders about everything else, too. And here is another historian who also explains a lot about the nature of Russia. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian of the 4th century AD, his Creation of History, a very famous historian, in fact, like Herodotus. And here is what he writes about the location of these ogres in the territory of modern Russia, where they lived. The Sarmatian country stretches from the Danube to the Don, that is from the Danube to the Don, the country of the Sarmatians, is the territory of modern Ukraine. From the Danube to the Don, as it says in our Ukrainian hymn, which is the border, that is the Don, which is the border between Europe and Asia. On the other side of the Don dwell the Alans, that is also another Sarmatians who lived there. They inhabited the vast deserts of Scythia, whose names come from the mountains, and like the Persians, who by their victories conquered the surrounding peoples and gave them their name. Further eastward dwell the Melanchlini, and then the cannibals, the Androphagi again. They lead, these cannibals, a wandering way of life, so that all the neighbors scattered from them because they did not want to live near them. So the whole country to the north and east, all the way to China, is deserted. That is, these ogres again lead a wandering lifestyle, all the neighbors scattered from them. It reminds me of Russia today, all run away from it, because they do not want to live near. And so the whole country from the cannibals to the north and east all the way to China is empty. This, I take it, is all about today's Russia. So what do we have? These cannibals look like people, that is, they dress like people, speak a different language, though. And, accordingly, they have fierce customs, nomadic life, which allows them to go to the Crimea, for example, and then cry out that they have to leave there. And, as a matter of fact, their nomadic movement through the regions, as well as these fierce customs without law and without truth. They have no truth, no law. We in Ukraine know very well that Russia has neither truth nor law. But someone will say that this is a very long time ago, that this is an antiquity, this is an androphagous cannibalistic antiquity in Russia. I would say that it is not so long ago, because the Stone Age is 6,000 years from the present-day Ukraine, and from Russia only 1,500 years. That is 4 times further. It still matters, it matters a lot. In addition, we could show a map, I will attach it here to the video with one of the first comments, a map of cannibalistic regions, which was drawn by scientists, academic German scientists in the 1890s. And here they were in the 1890s, part of the territory of Russia, but so they're closer to the Urals, was painted as cannibalized. This is 1893, as you understand, not very long ago. Then, by the way, Germany and Russia had normal relations, that is, this was not propaganda before the First World War. And then, to whom this is not enough, you could tell what mores reign in today's Russia, how many kinds of crimes there are, which have no explanation at all, and so on. But we can also turn to evidence, to Russian literature. There is Nikolai Leskov, a great Russian writer, who wrote about the year 1840, about events in Russia as he saw them in his childhood. And what did he write? He wrote that in 1840 in the province of Oral, people were making candles from human fat. That is, it was like that, imagine. And what did they want? They wanted to cause rain in the province of Oriol, those Muscovites. And this is how he writes. A stranger came from somewhere and spent the night at the little man's house. He listened, telling grief, evil, happiness of no rain, and said that he knows this case, that in this trouble the priests will not help, and it is necessary to go out into the field with a lighted candle made of drunken man fat, buried on the rutted roads, without a cross and without a pastor. The unknown man was a hoarder, and in his bag he had just the kind of candle he needed. He had a long one before, but he had already burned it in many places where there was the same no rain, and everywhere as if it had rained. We collected eggs and 6 grivnas of money from the world and went with him to pray in the field at night. He waved to us at the cross with a lighted candle of human fat, and told us to wait for the dew in the morning, and the cloud at noon, but not to disturb it, because it can turn in the other direction. Well, then the cloud didn't come, and they saw these local Orlov aborigines, so to speak, saw a man running in the field, a familiar man who was just a local drunkard. Not a squirrel seemed to him, but that some bull was running after him, and they considered him guilty that the clouds didn't come, so they went and stabbed him and, accordingly, made a candle of his fat, burned the barn with that candle. And how did it all reveal up? Leskov writes this based on his own observations on his own estate. And then the third man, as Leskov writes, then the third man took Kosian by the legs, all 3 of them carried him into the forest, where there are densely overgrown ravines. There immediately occurred a disagreement, and Kosian shouted in a sigh, "Why are you shaving me?" And then everything calmed down, and then the men went down to the brook, and by that brook they began to wash. And some girl discovered it all, and they were summoned and confessed that they had really been in the old halves with the candle, in the halves of the barn, that is with a candle made of Kosio's fat. And probably inadvertently and otherwise. It was no longer about how they started the fire in the half barn, but about what the reference to the Kosio's lard candle was made from. Well, that was his name. Who had the courage to go down to the bottom of the deep ravine in the long forest found this corpse of this Kosio, and there under the brush and dry leaves of last year's leaf fall they saw a badly decomposed corpse, which the whole village unanimously recognized as the corpse of Sornik Kosian. All the inner fat had already been scraped out of Kosio's fat. From it, in all probability, a sufficient number of candles have been made, burned in various places and so on. And this Leskov, of course, is a horrible Russophobe, having written the story Lev Shah. That is, he was a Russophobe, because he spoke the truth. He had such a special Russophobia, he spoke the truth, he wrote. And he described some Englishwoman, Hildegard Vassilyevna, who is shocked by all this, by this residual cannibalism. And his aunt says, yes, there is a veil of tears, a hunger of the mind, a hunger of the heart, and a hunger of the soul. And thus, very interesting, I recommend everyone to read Leskov's Udol. I mean, what is it about? All the writers who wrote honestly about Russians, they are in the 19th century, in the 20th even. If you take, for example, the same Leskov, take Platonov, for example, take anyone. If you take Chekhov, when he writes not about the nobility, not about the elite, so to speak, but about the people, you will see that he writes about primitive people, really primitive people. I especially recommend Platonov, Andrei Platonov. A very talented Russian writer, by the way. I mean, what do we see? We see that the peculiarities of Russians. What are their peculiarities today? Well, beastly cruelty. So, it is already proved, we see it in Ukraine. No fairy tales can hide it. Where does this beastly cruelty come from? Well, if people are primitive, in fact, not quite a long time ago from this animal world. That is, it seems to them, and it seems to Russians, that if you have not killed, then you will be killed. That is, they still live in such an animal world, and the echoes of this, respectively, affect their worldview. That is, Russians really think that it is necessary to kill everyone who can be reached. That is, such a primordial history. Hence these threats to the whole world, hence this separation of themselves from the whole world, and so on. That is, this nature, this animal cruelty, is from there, from primitive society. Well, what other qualities of Russians, except this cruelty? Well, there is the ability to adopt everything quickly, to take everything externally. That is, without understanding the meaning, but adopting, so to speak, the external form. This, again, is the property of primitive people. That is, it seems to them that having built a plywood plane from some palm leaves, this plane, accordingly, will produce some gifts for them. You know, this story in general is famous in the islands, where Aborigines saw a plane, then made an exact replica of such a plane out of palm leaves and expected that from it, what would sprinkle out of it, accordingly, good. And the Russians in the same way, for example, call their Khans presidents, their subordinates of Khan their senators, and so on. But they don't actually borrow anything, because it is hard to understand the essence of it, but they borrow the form very easily. And when they look at Western society, they always see some kind of gay Europe, some kind of gay pride, and they never see the deepest thing that is in Western culture. No genius of thought and so on. That is, it is not accessible. They see only the most superficial things that catch their eye. I mean, it's quite so typical of people in the primitive that come out of that primitive system. They're really very grabby about external things and they do imitation or monkeying around. Russians love anything shiny. I mean, they love it. Well, accordingly, if you look, their taste is not very, to put it mildly, in Russians. Well, not all of them, of course, but many. Again, this is related to the taste that people for whom everything is shiny can have as an indicator of status. Because of this status, they are very much in pursuit. Russians kneel before the leader. That is, this kind of kneeling. The ancients wrote a great deal about this, that they simply smashed bumps on their foreheads when they fell in front of their leaders, so to speak. Why? Because, well, accordingly, in the cave this leader is totalitarian, he very completely controls everything, who looked at whom and, accordingly, punishes. So he needs to fall right into the knives. No means of checks and balances that arise in human society at the stage of military democracy, for example. None of this has happened yet. Russia has not yet matured even to military democracy. It went straight from primitive society to communism, also primitive. And, accordingly, there is adoration before the leader, but at the same time, as soon as the leader weakens, as soon as the Akela misses, he is trampled. As a matter of fact, knowing these properties of his people, of the Russian people, Putin holds on to power this way, because he understands that he will be trampled by his own grateful countrymen. Here's what else. What other characteristics of Russians do we know? Yes, as a matter of fact, all of them, which, well, disrespect for the law, it is quite clear. I mean, what laws can there be in a cave? None. I mean, it's all conditioned. There are no external restraints. Internal, to be exact. That is, a man is restrained exclusively by force. That is, if you let the Russians free, they will create mayhem and pogrom. They are not able to control themselves from the inside. That is, there is no conscience. Such immorality. And this immorality is a product of those very voices, those very epochs. Such systemic immorality. Because scientists often say that primitive men, especially those who live in very harsh conditions, do not have general morality. That is, they each have their own morality. I mean, the Russian truth, yes. They have morals that don't apply to everyone. Well, that's why. Because everyone is fighting for the bone. Here. They're fighting over the bone. Whoever got up first, takes the shoes. So we can say that the Russians have this, well, there is a certain savvy. Because in this cave, you have to push your shoulders and try to steal and so on. This is this widespread stealing, this propensity to steal. Where does this come from? Again, from the primitive system. Because, well, in the primitive system, the concept of property is very weak. That is, someone fell asleep, something was taken away from him, and he is no longer an owner. That is, in primitive societies. And, consequently, Russians do not understand very well where there is something that is theirs and not theirs. That is, everything they can get their hands on, everything seems to belong to them. If a policeman stops them, this is called Russophobia. That is, if a policeman stops these thieves. That's it. So there is a certain savvy, because in this, respectively, in the battle for the bone it is necessary to survive. But the main thing, of course, is this complete moral relativism called. That is, the absence of morality itself. That is, on those who have any echoes of morality considered natural to the human race. In Russia, they are looked upon as fools. Which, as one Dutchman wrote, I think, in Russia, that if someone was honest among the Russians, which was very rare, they said that he was stupid and did not know how to live. And one Danish ambassador said that Russians do not lie if they have hair growing on their palms. That is, no one, everyone lies. And so on. Why am I telling you this? Not to humiliate anyone. Because that is the fate of the Russian people. Not so long ago to come out of the caves. Not to humiliate, but to understand the instincts of this people. That he will be this way. That the nation has not passed, it has skipped these thousands of years of evolution of other nations. And now does Russia have an opportunity ahead of these thousands of years of evolution, so to speak, to skip quickly? Some people manage to do it. There are some quite decent countries in Africa, which are even closer. But they are decent at the moment. But these countries, they didn't destroy their best men. In Russia, we see that the whole history of Russia is a scratch out of some humanistic, not primitive ideas. It's a feigned show of being Europe, shall we say. The whole of Russian history, starting there from the Mongol-Tatar yoke, to Ivan the Terrible, to the Bolsheviks, to Putin. Here. And, accordingly, how Russia is going to come out of all this, I think it just won't have time to come out. It won't have time. It doesn't have that time, it doesn't have the desire, it doesn't have any possibility. I think the best thing that can happen to Russia is if it finds itself, respectively, a yellow master in China, and it extends to them a little bit the properties that the Chinese have today. I think that's probably what will happen. That is, it will. First Russia will try to sell its resources to China, and then China will take them, and Russians will live by completely new rules. They will be accustomed to it just as many non-Chinese nationalities are accustomed to it in China. They will be accustomed to it, so to speak, by prolonged influence. Here. Well, I don't think it's a very long story, by the way. It's going to be pretty quick. It will probably be fast because the eras are now moving at lightning speed. That's the choice of the people. That's the kind of destiny. And to make it all speed up, I urge you to help the real heroes, to help the valiant Ukrainian soldiers, who all have a concept of verticality, as opposed to. There is a notion of something high, of their homeland. I urge you to help with the purchase of another second car. Unfortunately, we still have not collected for it, but it is already close to the unit, which is now liberating the south of Ukraine from the Russian-fascist invaders. You can help to the card Privatbank 5168-7451-08-46-1010. The recipient, a soldier of this unit, a soldier, my friend Oleksandr Kanibor. So, friends, let's help and remember that history is the thing that teaches us a lot. Which teaches us both the good and, accordingly, teaches us to avoid the bad. That is the most important purpose and meaning of history. Bless you. Glory to God and glory to Ukraine.